So to start off with, I'm just going to talk about certain things which are specific to React. These are going to be a bit more advanced compared to what you've done. So I went into briefly about what package JSON files do, and so I'm just going to go a bit more detail about the difference and exactly what they have. Package JSON files will have the exact dependency version, whatever you do. You may know about this, but for example, if it's above 11.10.5, this basically means that this is the base version that is acceptable, and any version above this is also acceptable. So that's what package JSON is going to refer to. It's also going to have the start configuration. So for example, when you start your React application, you're going to write npm start like this. And what this actually does is it doesn't actually start the application directly. It goes into the package.json and it finds the scripts and it looks for where does it say start. And wherever it says start, it runs that specific script the whole way. Right. So in this case, it's going to run disable ESLint plugin true, etc., etc. So it actually does this. So yeah, that's basically what the package.json file does. You can also test, eject, and lint the stuff. Linting basically means that it's going to check your code for code quality, right? So if you run a linter, it's going to give you results. They're telling you that you haven't used certain variables certain ways, and just to show you why linters are really useful. Let me just go to a specific file. As you can see, it's giving you an error over here. Now, the interesting thing is Java won't actually give you this error. Java doesn't give you this error. The linter gives you this error because JavaScript is going to say that, okay, you have this specific variable, but there's no problem in having it. We don't care if you use it or not. But the linter, which is in my case is ESLint, is going to say, I have two linters actually, ESLint and SonarLint, both are very nice. They automatically tell you when you have something wrong, so extremely, extremely useful. They're going to tell you that, okay, whatever you're doing right now, even though it's not technically incorrect, it might be useless or it might be wrong from a code design point of view. So they're extremely useful. And when you do npm run start, you can also do npm run lint, right? So it's going to tell you, okay, your code has all of these problems. So if I did npm lint instead of npm start, it's going to say npm run lint, I think. Give me a second. I think it's capital. Yeah. So over here, you can see it just displayed a bunch of errors that you just saw right now. And these are basically all the things that the linter caught and said, okay, you need to fix this. So you need to fix the fact that there's this thing in this file, etc., etc. These are not things that will specifically cause errors, but it's just the fact that these files have things that could be better done. So that's linters. And in your professional practice, you're always going to be using these, or at least you want to, because it catches a lot of your code errors before you even make them. For example, if you wanted to use the is loading variable and you used and you for example you put is loading over here and you spelled it wrong, is loading. So you put the L as a small instead of a capital. The normal JavaScript is not actually going to say that there's anything wrong, right? Your linter is going to say that this is not defined. JavaScript normally will not say anything. It's going to say, okay, you go ahead. So you're going to run into a lot of errors if you don't use linters. It's going to save a lot of your time. I would highly, highly recommend that all of you use linters. Okay, तो आपका linters cover हो गया. उसके बाद जरा आते हैं to the next thing, which was we had to cover what? Oh, the environment variables, right? So for example, when you have a React application, you're going to run into what happens is that you might have certain API keys or certain server URLs that you don't want to disclose publicly. You don't want them to be publicly available, but you still at the same time you still at the same time want to be able to use them, right? So for example, if you have a Google Maps API key, which was in my case, you won't actually use that key in your code, because if you use it in your code, whenever you host that code, your hosting provider will have access to your keys. And these keys are meant to be private, so you're not supposed to expose them. So the question becomes, how do you hide these things when your code actually uses it? And the answer to that is environment variables. So environment variables are the solution for that. And basically, there's going to be this file called a .env file. To run this .env file, you're just going to create .env in the root directory of your folder, not in src. Keep in mind, it's not in src, it's outside src. It's at the same level of hierarchy as src. It's not within src. This is really, really important because it's not a part of your source file. your React application is just at boot up going to use this variable once, and then it won't have access to it. That's the reason why it remains hidden, because it's running within your code, but your code doesn't itself have access to it. So anyone who uses, so if you're ever hosting a project online, it's going to be very, very important. People are going to look at this because from a security perspective, you need to hide sensitive information. So yeah, that's basically what an environment file is. The second thing is, um, let me just talk. I'll talk about some libraries, right? Oh yeah, I'll talk about the ESLint file before I go into the libraries.
I have a question. So if we're going to use a .env file, right?
Yeah.
In our get ignore, do we ignore the .env file? Would that cause a problem, or is it alright if we don't ignore it and just pass it on in our GitHub file?
So the thing is, it depends on your use case. But one thing is for sure, if your GitHub that repository is public, then you cannot push it to GitHub because that env file is going to be exposed publicly. So that's the first thing. So if you have a public GitHub repository, no, you do not want that env file to be pushed to GitHub. It has to stay on gitignore. For those of you who don't know what gitignore is, gitignore basically says that whatever these files are, pretend that they don't exist. So you see these grayed out files, that's basically Git saying that, look, I don't even know that you're there. You're invisible to me. So if you push this code onto GitHub, GitHub will not recognize these invisible files. And in the case of .env, it's very useful because you don't want this to be pushed to public application. As for a
So
private application,
right. So does that mean like if we're going to work with some sort of project where we have to use API keys, we make our GitHub repository private and then use it on public then?
look, the thing is, if you want to use a project where you want to use API keys, I would suggest that regardless of what you make your repository, just don't push the environment file to the GitHub repository. That makes a lot more sense because even when you have multiple collaborators, you don't necessarily want anyone who collaborates on it or anyone who wants to view your project to have access to that environment key. So ideally, you just want to keep that key wherever you host it. So wherever you're hosting the server, that's where the .env file is going to go. So at the moment, I'm hosting it on my local host, right? So it just needs to be in the folder structure where it's being hosted. If you host it online, something like Netlify or Firebase or Vercel, which are hosting platforms for your code, then they're going to have a separate place for environment variables. So as ideal practice, I would say just always put it in gitignore, and yeah, I always put it in gitignore. That's what I'd say. Don't take the risk of putting it in a private repository. There's no point. All right, so yeah, so that's the case. Okay, so yeah, back to ESLint files. What ESLint files basically do is they're going to define the set of rules that you want that your linter is going to have. So in my case, I've defined my rules for the linter to follow the professional code practices of people at Airbnb. Excuse me. For those of you who don't know, Airbnb acts as a standard when it comes to React coding design. So the components versus containers architecture was designed by Airbnb. The file naming structure that most people use nowadays is designed by Airbnb. The coding rules that people use for how lines should be arranged, how the code should be structured, is like the person spearheading that movement is a company of Airbnb, right? So in my case, you can just tell tell React that you're going to be following Airbnb guidelines for this. There's an Airbnb package that you have to install. So you have to do npm install Airbnb style guide. I forgot what the exact thing is. And then it installs that linter for Airbnb. And what's the amazing thing is, even though you're working here, you don't know what the best practices for React are. Just by installing this plugin or package, whatever it is, it actually automatically tells you when you're doing something wrong. So it's like getting the skills and experience of a person in Airbnb, but your code's doing it for you. So your code is, so for example, if I'm writing code and you don't know what the line structure is going to be like, right? So suppose you write something like this and you add two lines over here. This is considered a bad coding because you disorganize your code to a degree. So ESLint is going to say, actually, it's going to say no multiple empty lines, and that's basically saying organize your code better. And so you can actually delete that and then it'll go away, right? Or the same thing is if you add a single space bar, a single space bar. You'd say, okay, that shouldn't give an error, but ESLint is actually going to give you an error because it's going to say that expected indentation of 12 spaces but found 13. So it actually forces you to indent your code properly, structure it properly, space it properly. Even in fact, if you correct this error and you add a space before the React component name, it's going to say no. A space is forbidden after the opening bracket. And the whole point of this is code consistency. It forces your entire code to be consistent. So everything you do is automatically going to be made consistent. And the beautiful thing about this is a lot of people actually spend time manually fixing their coding configuration. So if you have a bunch of code that's like this, it's going to take a very long time to fix. You're actually going to be manually going to each line, pressing backspace, backspace. Oh, okay, that makes sense. Backspace again, that makes sense. Let me just fix that again, fix that again. Small things like that. This can take up hours of your time for no reason. And the insane thing about ESLint is you can configure it so that it auto formats and save. So ESLint is going to auto format your code on save, and that's so useful because you can have a whole page that's completely disorganized. Imagine a new programmer came and they gave code that works, but it's extremely difficult to read. It looks something like this. Look. And to any normal human being, it's going to cause a headache. You're going to be like, how can I read this? What is this code? This is so difficult to read. Why is it so disorganized? And but when you configure your ESLinter, so it formats and save, you just have to press one button, which is Command S, two buttons basically, Command S, which basically means save the file. And when you save the file, watch the magic. It fixed everything by itself. It fixed everything by itself. You might have one or two major things that it doesn't fix because it thinks that you're actually forcing the conventions there. But for the most part, it'll just fix everything. So if your errors, 99% of them will go away. Maybe one or two might stay, which you'll manually have to fix. So that's going to save you a lot of time, a lot of time. So I would highly recommend that all of you install this extension called ESLint and have an ESLint file. The way you, yeah, you'll have to follow some instructions for the linting. I can give you guys a link for that. And if you follow them, you'll have this linter setup, and it's just going to make your coding so much easier because you can write anything and just auto formats and save. So all of things, every code you write is just perfectly formatted. So yeah, that's what linters are, and they're extremely useful. In companies, you actually have things called pre-commit hooks, which basically means when a person pushes the commit, it doesn't allow that commit to even pass if the coding structure is just bad. So that's called a pre-commit hook. And each time they commit something, the commit will fail. It's going to say you do not pass the pre-commit hook. So yeah, that's extremely useful when you want to have teams which are larger in nature and you want to force a certain coding style. Okay. So let's talk a bit about Redux in a bit of detail, since we talked about this briefly, but not in sufficient detail for you guys to understand what's going on. So Redux basically solves the issue of state management, right? What do you mean by state management? Well, when we have variables, when we have components in React, we talked about the React hierarchy, right? And how in React you have. In fact, let me just show you what the React hierarchy is going to look like. If you actually run this application, npm start. Just give it a second. It's going to run. So this is an application that I've been working on. And I would recommend you guys also install React developer tools. It basically allows you to see what's going on in React within your browser console. So you don't have to constantly go back and forth with debugging. You just click on React developer tools. You click on reload. You click on inspect element, and there's these two new tabs added to you called components and profiler. And basically what they do is you can actually see the entire component hierarchy, which is very difficult to do otherwise, right? So it's very beautiful. You can actually see the exact components, menu bar, box, div, etc. It makes debugging way easier. It's gonna save you hours of time in the long run. And you can actually see the exact spacing and component structure or whatever you have. But just to get back to my point about Redux, as you can see clearly, there are parents and there are children, right? So there's a menu app bar, there's a box, and then there's another routes, and there's rendered route, then there's a home page, this box. So when you have a component that's directly within another component, like the menu app bar and the box relationship, this is called a parent-child relationship. And that basically means that one parent basically calls another child within it, right? And so in this case, it's very easy to pass information because a parent can pass it directly to the child. And we talked yesterday about how the child can pass it back to the parent using handlers. But the difficulty comes in the case when you don't have parents and children, but you have siblings or almost cousins. So, for example, if you have a div and its parent is a box, how do you access the information for this div and then give it back to this other homepage over here, which has absolutely no connection to this? Maybe it does have a connection based on the root, on its parent, but just to transfer all the props there, you would have to actually transfer it to every parent all the way up to the common ancestor, and only that way will you have an access to the memory store. You understand? Because the child cannot pass the data to the sibling. He has to pass the data to the parent, and then the parent has to pass the data to the other child. Two children do not have any direct connection with one another. So this problem was actually a very big problem, and to solve this problem they came up with this thing called redux. And what is redux? Redux is basically a form of state management where instead of storing the variables within a component, it stores a variable within the entire application. So it's like an application wide state management system. So instead of, for example, your form data being stored over here, the form data is actually going to be stored in a general store, which can be accessible to everyone. That's essentially what the concept of React is. So you can kind of think of it as a storage container that's actually within your entire application, and you can access any variable just by going to the store and retrieving it. But because of the way React Redux is designed, it's a bit complex because you might be accessing multiple variables from different places at different times. So there's this thing called race conditions, where you access one variable before another, and you end up having problems, right? For example, if this form is changing at the same time as this form, and both of them are somehow dependent on the output of each other. So, for example, logging in over here, let's suppose it was dependent on this form and this form. If you logged in and your data somehow got one form before the other, which used to happen before when you didn't have Redux, your logging in would become problematic. This is called a race condition. Race conditions are basically when you call two asynchronous threads. Asynchronous threads are basically when your code is running a side effect away from the main tree. So imagine your code is running in a straight line, but it wants to retrieve some data. So instead of running in the straight line, it goes to the side, tries getting some data, and then brings it back to the straight line. The thing is, you can have two of these threads, and the order in which they return back to the main line actually makes the output different. So it makes it very difficult to predict how your application is going to behave. Sometimes it's going to work, sometimes it won't work. And this is, and in computers, it's called a lack of determinism, right? And determinism is very, very important code, because determinism means that the same code will result in the same output. And so Facebook's running into this problem for a long time, where its code was non-deterministic. It was, you were running the same pages over and over again, and they were giving different outputs, and was causing people to like tear their hair apart. Right? It was very complex, and um, it was just messing with their minds. So that's how Redux came in, and the way Redux solved this problem was, it said every form of state is going to be a single global variable. So if, for example, you have 200 pieces of data within your application, that data will not be stored in different places. It will all be stored in one big chunk, and each time that data changes, that whole big chunk will change, right? This is called new having an immutable state. And this is a very important concept. You're going to find this in OOPS as well. It's called mutability. And what mutability basically means is that the entire object has to be the same on the reference base level for you to recognize it as the same. So what that means is, before you could go to the whole store, and if a single variable changed, you could say, hey, just give me that variable and come back with that variable. And the whole application would not know that the store changed, because it would treat this variable as a separate variable, the other variable as a separate variable. But now what Redux did was, Redux said, no, all of those variables combined make one specific instance of the store. The moment you change any one variable, it says the entire store is now a new store. So now it's going to say, oh, why are you bringing me that old state back? I've changed. And so this is the whole concept of mutability from a theoretical perspective. This is very important for people, if those of you who are giving interviews. Not so important for those of you who are working on a practical level and just trying to get the job done. But yeah, it's very important in the long run. And so that's why Redux came with quite a bit of overhead, right? So in Redux, there are four to five main things that you have to keep into account. There's a store, and the store basically what it does is it stores all your data, all your variables, basically variables in one big chunk. Okay, you can also call the state a single state, right? Because the store consists of a single state, and each time any one of these variables changes, the entire state changes. So if you're currently going like the state is equal to the same, if you run this function state is equal to state, and you did state dot, for example, form name is equal to something else, your entire state reference will now not be the same. This is a very important concept, and that's basically what immutability means. That just because you change a single variable within state, it now won't be equated to the same state. Okay, that's state. The next thing you want is this thing called a reducer. And what a reducer is basically going to do is it's going to take in information, and based on that information, it's going to return an output, which is going to be a new state, right? So, for example, you could take in a form name. And based on that form name, you're going to develop a new state, which is going to have that form name and the rest of the information. So you're going to have rest of information, and you're going to have the form name. That's basically what a reducer is, right? A reducer, and this is actually a mathematical, or I wouldn't say mathematical, but a logic-based concept. It's actually called, how reduction is. It's kind of like that. You take an input and an existing state, and based on that, you reduce a new state based on the inputs, right? It's a very logical concept. Okay, so then we've talked about this. Then let's talk a bit about slice. What's a slice? A slice is basically kind of how do you represent a single piece of information within the store, right? So if a slice might contain, in my case, it contains a value with a bearer token. It's basically your authentication and an ID. You can store whatever you want in a slice, but you can think of it as a single piece of information. All right. Then you have what's called um, a selector, right? And the selector is basically, sorry, selector. Selector is basically, why am I doing this? Yeah, it's basically how you would retrieve that specific piece of information that you wanted. So let's suppose you created a slice, and the slice was slice of what should you say? It should be like a slice of a data from an API call. Data from an API call. It was let's call this what do you want to call it? Let's call it a bank information info, right? Now, the thing is, when you actually retrieve, it's one thing to store that bank information, but it's another thing to retrieve that bank information. And so, when you're retrieving that bank information, you're going to call a selector, and the selector is going to say, "Oh, hey, look, I need to select the relevant information that I want from the store," right? So you're going to say, "Okay, tell me what you want." And you're going to say, "Okay, I want the bank info," and he's going to say, "Okay, here you go," and it's going to return the existing bank info that it has from the state, existing bank info, right? That's exactly what a selector is. And so we've talked about stores, we've talked about reducers and slices. So the slice is kind of like variable declaration, right? This is a reducer is kind of like creating a new object based on some existing properties. So you can kind of think of it as a constructor. It's very similar in concept to constructor, where you take an input and you create a new instance of something. A selector is kind of like a getter, where you're kind of getting a certain variable based on whatever you want to get. So you could be like get data, and you'd get the data, or you could be like get height, and you'd get the height. That's what selector is. And so the last thing you'd want is to update the data, and this is done by a dispatch call, right? So it's very similar to kind of how an object is. How there's an object, then how the object has a constructor, which takes the info and creates a new object, creates a new object, and then the object has properties. You can have where you can declare each property, and then that property is going to have a name, right? So the object has properties, and and then the project object has a getter and setter, and the getter is basically going to say, okay, get me this. You might have, for example, name dot get, right, or get name etc. जो भी हो, ठीक है? And it's going to get you whatever variable is in the name, right? And then the object is also going to have a set, so it's going to have, like, for example, a set name, and you just set the name whatever you have. So Redux is very similar to that. The store is the whole object. The reducer is your constructor that's going to basically make a new object based on a new information that you want to enter. The slice is basically a single property of that object, right? The selector is basically getting a specific property from that object. And the dispatch is basically going to say dispatch command, dispatch this information to the server, sorry, to the Redux store, and it's gonna take whatever information you just have, and it's gonna send it there and update the store. You understand? So dispatch. So just to show you guys in action, um, show you where it is. It's over here. See if I can use it. Dispatch. Yeah. So over here, you can see I kind of took a login beta token and I kind of sent it to the main store so that it can be updated. So that's how the dispatch does. The dispatch is basically connection from a certain page to the store. So it's kind of like sending data and updating it, right? And this is kind of how what a reducer looks like. So you have a single slice, and the reducer is going to say, okay, given this login state and an action, you're going to take whatever just happened with the existing state, and its value is going to be the action dot payload. So whatever payload you ask, you enter within the action, that's going to become your new value. And then console.log is an additional thing you can do. So reducer is kind of like the action you do whenever you have this whatever dispatch run. So like the dispatch is kind of like the messenger that you sent, and the reducer is kind of like the guy waiting for the messenger to do something. So it's a two-step process. You send a message from your kingdom, tell the armies to attack. So this messenger runs across to your army, and it tells the commander, look, you want to attack the enemy, and the commander is going to say, okay guys, we need to attack the enemy. So the dispatch is kind of like your messenger that you send out to the army, and the reducer is kind of like your army general who kind of takes that message and does something with it. Alrighty then. Okay, that's basically Redux covered. One last thing you want to add is the action. The action is kind of like uh, whatever the message is, right? So like in our case, we talked about how we're dispatching something, and so imagine that जो भी आपका messenger है वो कुछ information लेके भेजेगा ना उस general को. So that information is basically called an action. Okay, I want to do this action. So in our case, the action was that we wanted to send an API and authentication information. So we did action dot payload, which basically means within this action, I'm going to send you the payload for whatever authentication I want to do. And based on that action, you can now process that authentication and check if the person is actually an admin or not, or a correct user or not. That's basically what it is. And yeah, that's basically Redux in a nutshell for you guys. Redux is really, really important. Before you used to use Redux with its entire boilerplate code, but now we have this thing called the Redux toolkit, and the Redux toolkit is a new and improved. The Redux toolkit is basically an easier and more accessible version of the Redux boilerplate code, because normally when you write Redux as boilerplate code, it's much longer. So using a toolkit basically says, okay, I can do the same thing with a lot lesser code. It creates all the reducers and stuff for you. So yeah, that's basically Redux. And yeah, we've got a driver and we've got a backend admin. We've got a backend admin. Just give me 1 second, guys. Let me get back to you. Have I made the recordings of the previous things available for you or not? Guys, uh, have I made the previous recordings available to you? Did I send you guys a link on the group or not?
We'll just check that.
बिकॉज मुझे याद पड़ रहा है कि मैंने आप लोगों को भेजा है और अभी मुझे एक स्टूडेंट का मैसेज आया है कि जो है आई हैवंट अपलोड द रिकॉर्डिंग्स द ग्रुप लिंक someone send it to him please. ओके सो यार आपको मालूम हुआ है कि वो मैंने लिंक आप लोगों को भेजी थी या नहीं वो इसकी रिकॉर्डिंग्स की बिकॉज मुझे याद पड़ा मैंने भेजी है any luck Hassan? Did you find anything?
No, yesterday's video is not on the YouTube channel.
Oh, is it, you guys are accessing a YouTube channel. Oh, okay. Okay, I sent the links, but I sent them on the WhatsApp group. I think a lot of you were expecting it to be on the YouTube channel.
Yeah.
I see. Understandable. तो मैं बता दूंगा कि मैंने लिंक्स इधर भेजी हैं यूट्यूब पे मैं बाद में अपलोड कर दूंगा सही है बट या तो ठीक है तो आपका ये हो गया इसके बाद जो है let's just we covered Redux. Redux is pretty complex. You guys really want to practice Redux? I haven't been giving you guys any assignments. If you guys want, I can give you assignments. But the thing is, आप लोगों की मसरूफियात इतनी होंगी कि I highly doubt आपको time मिलेगा. So that's why I didn't give you guys any assignments at the moment. ठीक है. Okay, so what else is left? Oh yeah, we want to talk about a bit about industry standard libraries and stuff. So I'm going to talk about. Let me have a look at. Yeah, so there's one library which is very useful. It's called Formic, and I'll actually just show you guys a library over here, Formic React, so you guys can actually see them.
Isn't that for creating forms?
Yeah, that's for creating forms, exactly. And it's forms and validation. So you can see kind of the Airbnb logo here because Airbnb is the leader within React things. But when you write forms in React, you can actually either write them manually, but it's a lot better to actually use Formic to build forms because it's easy to add validation, it's easy to scale them, it's easy to add UI to them. It's basically everything done for you, so you don't have to write a lot of code. So you can see over here, it's a working way of using Formic. They've got the entire initial values. They've got the whatever getters they have, and etc. These things, submit functions. It's all done for you. So you don't have to do that manually. So it's extremely useful. You can see exactly what it does over here, right? It's got error messages. It's got field level validation. It's got custom validation. It's got API errors, right? It's got forms that save themselves. So that's Formic. Okay. Have a look at the Redux. Actually, we talked about Redux, right? What else do we have? Okay, we have Formic. We have Redux. We have Axios. We already talked about that. Okay, let me just show you guys Material UI, what it actually looks like, what it actually does. So it's basically React UI tools pre-built for you, so you don't have to build them. So instead of actually going and building an entire page from start to end, it actually just gives you a few snippets of code. You can copy paste them, and basically you've got a whole running application within a couple of minutes. So in the industry, generally people use these because they're fast, they're quick, they're powerful, they're customizable. You can make all of these buttons and these forms and validation, all of these things from Material UI. Documentation is very well done. So for example, you have the MUI core and Material UI, and you can see all the components it has, the autocomplete button, you've got buttons, you've got checkboxes, you've got dividers, they've got whole demos for you to use them, you've got icons, you basically all आपके UI की सारी जो needs होंगी ना आपकी Material UI पूरी कर देगा. So if you search up Material UI, you're gonna get the answer. आपकी typography, different fonts हो गई, different font sizes हो गए, different font styles हो गए, वो आपके सारे available है. आपकी tool tips में, यानी अगर आपको एक चीज़ को tool tip दिखाना है कि ओके इसके ऊपर एक hint दे दें, वो भी आपके बन गया. आपका table elements वो भी इधर ही हैं. आपकी lists जो आपको बनानी होंगी वो भी हैं. आपकी icons, this is going to be very very useful because when you build larger applications you want to use icons everywhere instead of using text. So you're using icons over here. That's very nice. And then you got badges and chips and dividers. You've got text fields. Text fields are going to be very commonly used whenever you want to have a sign up, whenever you want to have a login. They're very commonly used here. You're going to have switches when you want to have toggle something on and off. You want to say, okay, this button is on, this button is off. The switch can be disabled, etc. It can be customized with different colors. It can have names with it. You can have like the slider components for volume buttons or ratings, whatever you want, right? You can have a rating scale, like for example if you're making a carpooling application, which I was doing, or you're just have a movie that you or like an app where you need something to rate. So you've got the rating thing. You've got a radio button, which is basically a set of buttons that you can select one of them and the other one automatically deselects. It's very useful for forms. You've got action buttons. These are very, very useful when you want to have. These are floating. What floating basically means is that they're kind of away from the usual structure of the page. So instead of it, if you this page is organized so that you have a central piece and then you have a list on the side and then you have certain things. They're going to go in a specific order. A floating action button is this. It kind of disobeys all the order. It says, I'm going to stand where I'm going to stand. I don't care if you zoom in. I don't care if you zoom out. I have my own place and I'm going to stick to that. So that's what a material, all of this is available in material UI. You've got autocomplete. Autocomplete basically says if you write something, it's going to complete it for you. All you have to do is write a few letters and basically it's extremely useful for things like Google Map applications and stuff like that. So yeah, you've got buttons and button groups. This you already know about. What else do you have? You've got alerts for letting you know, okay, the page has done something. So for example, if you press a button, it's going to pop up an alert on the top and you can remove and add those alerts based on what happened. It gives you information of, so for example, if you added a ride or you've added something to the cart, you want to alert to the user, okay, this happened. So this is where you'll be using alerts. You have dialogues. Dialogues are also very useful. They basically, if you want to have like something popping up and then going away, you want to use a dialogue for that. So for example, like this, etc., or slide in a dialogue. You can have progress indicators. They're very useful for when you're loading a page. I've actually used this myself when I was loading the API call. So for example, if you go to the okay, it didn't show here, but because it loaded so quickly. But normally, if it takes a little while to load, it's gonna show you this hovering circular icon, which basically shows you that the table is loading. That's called a circular progress indicator. It's not showing it right now because it's happening so fast. Anyway, so that's that, and we have a snack bar is basically like this thing ad that shows you that you've done something. So you can, this is very useful in application when you want to give the user feedback about what he's done, right? The accordion is basically very useful when you have like a set of, for example, recipes, or you want to have some information that can be expanded upon. So kind of like how in menus you have on the side, when you click on the menu, it expands it. And you see this on a lot of websites. You have basic information. When you click on basic information, it expands. So you will have about us, which expands and shows you some more information. You have an app bar, which can be horizontal or it can be vertical on the side. This is very useful for navigation. You generally have at least one of these per application. You're really going to need these. They're often scrollable. They have different buttons on them. They can be sticky, right? They can have triggers on them. Yeah, you have cards, your basic normal surfaces where you can actually have multiple things on them. So, for example, in this case, you have verb, adjective, etc. So, for example, if you're making um, a, an e-commerce application where you have shoes and you want to show a rating and etc on one thing, you want to use a card for that, right? A card will basically be your best friend for that because it allows you to do these things very easily. Paper is for any background that you might want to have for anything. So it's kind of like it's kind of going to be the backwards, the underlying surface for any elements that you want to add on top of it. That's what a paper does. And there are a bunch of things for navigation. You've got breadcrumbs, which basically shows you where you were previously and navigates back and forth. You've got drawers, so basically you can press it and it's going to create like a sidebar on the left or the top. It's very useful for like filtering things or like showing different shows, etc. You'll often see this on Netflix. You click on it and it shows you a bunch of shows. You've got the link element, which is basically useful for linking anything to another place, and it's kind of like the href thing, but it's basically a better version of that. So yeah, you've got a menu icon, which is just a basic menu. You know, you're gonna use this a lot, whatever the menu things is. So for example, if you have this thing, you've got this is actually not this. This is a menu because you've got a bunch of things. You can click on them and they do their work based on that. And then you've got a bunch of yeah, you've got a bunch of things over here. I'll just talk about final few. This pagination. Pagination is basically when you have a page where you might have 1,000, like for example, let's suppose you have 1,000 products and you only want to display 100 of them at a time because you're going to crash the page otherwise. Pagination basically allows you to do that. It says, okay, like you know in Google you have page 1, then 2, then 3, which you never have to access, but you can access it. And yeah, material UI has all of these things inbuilt. So just make it a point that use material UI instead of actually coding things yourself, because this is what these programmers have been doing. They've been coding this so your life becomes easier. Right, then you've got steppers. Steppers are basically how in many forms you want to have a first, then second, then third. So like how on form completions, you have first enter your education, then enter your degree, then enter your GPA. It's very useful for cases like that. And the last one is basically tabs, where you have different tabs basically, which can access different things and open different menus. Pretty useful for that. So yeah, that's basically it. Okay, so these are basically most of the components, and I'll just briefly go over what layout elements are. So when you're making your elements, you generally want to position them somewhere. So you might want to position something in the center or on the side. Instead of you actually using manual positioning elements, you can actually just put them within a box and use that box to position something. So it has this prop that allows you to basically say, okay, position to the left or position to the right, and you're going to start off building your pages starting off from boxes, because it's like a big box. It contains all the other elements within it, and yeah, that's basically it. Uh, and like there's a container which basically centers your content horizontally. Right? It's basically going to say whatever you have, center it horizontally. It's pretty straightforward. All right. So you've got a grid. A grid is very important. This is going to be the most commonly used element you have. Um, and basically the idea is you want to search upon CSS flexbox, which is basically an adaptable page. Like if you see this page, it actually adapts to zooming in, zooming out, and you might wonder how does it do that. That's pretty interesting. It's because this concept called flexbox, which is basically the whole page flows. It's one fluid state. It adapts to how you zoom in, zoom out. It's very important in the industry, because you want to cater to people of multiple different zooms, multiple different screen orientations, different pixel heights and widths of laptops and PCs. So this is exactly your friend for that. A grid basically is a 2D, is a two-dimensional structuring element. So it allows you to structure elements not just horizontally but also vertically. A stack, on the other hand, is a one-dimensional structuring element. So it allows you to structure elements either horizontally or vertically. So if you just want to structure your elements in one direction, you're going to use a stack. If you want to order them in two directions, you're going to use a grid, right? So for example, if you have, in this case, you're having things which are um, ordered horizontally and vertically in different ways. So you're going to use the grid for that. If you're using something that's just ordered horizontally or vertically, you're going to use a stack. The image list is kind of pointless. You might be using this if you want to show a bunch of movies, etc. So but yeah, that's basically it. That's a material UI library for you. I just give you guys a bunch of commonly used things in the industry. आप लोग इसी पे काम कर रहे होंगे, मैं जिस पे काम करता हूँ, just I'm working in a company right now. So this is the what we use as our, how do you say, default UI component. So yeah, that's basically it. And I think this marks the end of our React series. We've gone from React from the beginnings of not knowing what React is to a bit more advanced, to covering lifecycle methods and components and containers, structure, architecture, clean code, extensions, linters. I hope you guys learned a lot from these sessions, and I hope that you can use this information and work on it. This is just theoretical information. It's completely useless if you don't apply it yourself. I would highly, highly recommend that you guys go back and build an application from scratch in React so that you have something to show on your GitHub profile. This is going to be your leeway into entering the job world. This is if you want to go for part-time jobs earlier on, you get access into a good job. React is your way to go. It's very new. It's very high in demand. It's very quick, and if you gain mastery over this, you will excel in terms of the pay ranges you get, in terms of the growth you get, in terms of the access of companies you have. So yeah, guys, that's basically it. I've recorded this meeting and I'm going to upload it in a while. So I wish you guys all the best. And Hamza asked that box, grid, and stack are alternatives of Flexbox. Could you illustrate what you mean by alternatives of Flexbox? I don't exactly understand your question. Hamza, are you there? Oh yeah, yeah. Okay, understandable. Yeah, basically, yeah, you could say that. But they're a lot easier to work with. Flexbox and Bootstrap is very, very annoying in my opinion. You have to add a lot of customization to it, and React's kind of like you change one thing and the whole thing starts working. So yeah, you could say they're alternatives to Bootstrap. Yeah. Can you give the assignments after finals? I can give them. That's up to you. I'll give them right now. You guys can submit them whenever you want to. All right. I can give them after the finals, but it's going to be kind of pointless because a lot of people might ruin their vacations. So I'm going to give them right now. Whoever wants to do it can do it whenever they want to. It's up to you guys. So yeah, वो मैं आप लोगों को अपलोड करके दे दूंगा. जिसको करना है वो कर लीजिएगा. I can check them for you guys and report on your coding skills and give you guys feedback. So just use this opportunity as best as you can. The group link, yeah, sure. I'll send you guys a group link. The group link is um, yeah, the group link is GDSC Web Development Bootcamp. There's a link over here. Group link, stations, group info. Okay, I don't have access to the group link. I'm really sorry, but I will ask them to give you the access, Hamza. Um, I actually don't have access to the group, or else I would have given to you. So, oh, you already knew a bit of React. Okay, so this is your first lecture. Understandable. Understandable. I think it makes sense. This was designed for beginners. Yeah, so we covered a lot of things redundantly. All right, guys, I'm going to be ending the meeting. I wish you guys all the best. ठीक है कोई issues you guys can feel free to message me. कोई industry के बारे में question हो तो पूछ लो आप लोग. I can help you out. All right. Take care, guys. खुदा हाफिज़.